He thought he was getting away with it. The lies, the cheating, the late-night text. He had it all under control, or so he thought. But tonight, she is in control. She's known for weeks. She's read every message, traced every lie. And now, she's sitting across from him, smiling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the end of this night, he won't just be exposed, he'll be ruined. And the best part, he never saw it coming.
The softly golden hues the flickering candlelight created over the nicely laid table. Fresh roses combined with the strong aroma of red wine created the ideal romantic illusion. Julia sat across from him, her lips softly smiling, and her attitude friendly. Every element of the evening had been painstakingly placed, just as he wanted it. Background soft music, the kind that made events seem to last forever. He had no idea. The hum of the phone persisted, exactly on schedule. Julia sipped her wine slowly, her gaze always fixed on him. She noticed his slightly twitchy fingers as he looked at the screen. It was hardly discernible. It was only a flutter of uncertainty until he pushed an easy smile by flipping the phone face down on the table. She asked, important, tilting her head. "Just work," he said calmly, grabbing for his own drink. His voice was also exactly constant, the mask of a man who had too long been honing his lies. Julia nodded simply, a knowing glitter in her eyes. She knew for weeks as well. She had seen the indicators, followed the contradictions, watched as the guy she loved collapsed into someone she no longer knew. Late evenings were the beginning of it. Then followed the apologies, the abrupt attention in his looks, the careful way he kept his phone close, always on silence, always face down. Julia had been rather patient, though. She had waited, observed, and when the proper moment arrived, she had assembled every component of the jigsaw. She had seen the photographs, listened to the voicemails, read the notes. And tonight all of that was ready to descend on him. She slanted slightly forward, resting her chin on her hand, her voice as soft as silk. "You know," she added, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." He grinned, glad for the seeming change of subject. "Yeah." She turned to nod. About trust, deviance from integrity." His fingers drew tightly around his glass, an additional flutter of unease. Julia reached into her purse, slow, careful, and grabbed her phone. She tapped the screen, then carefully set it between them on the table. One he knew all too well. A familiar communication thread blazed out. His face came devoid of color. The messages were obvious right away. Every phrase, every treachery, every hushed pledge to another lady. His mouth opened but no sound emerged. Julia let out a breath, slanted slightly headwise. "Anything you would want to say?" "Julia, She raised a finger before he could finish to quietly silence him. She tapped a well-groomed nail against the table, musing over yelling. "Thought about throwing this wine in your face, making a scene, letting the whole restaurant know exactly kind of man you are." He choked hard, his hands shaking just a little. Then she said, a gentle smile curving her lips, "I realized that would be too easy." His gaze flicked throughout the restaurant, his head whirling in search of damage control. She lacked completion. "In fact," she replied, voice quiet yet steely, "I thought I would do something a little more memorable." She raised her phone once again with almost dramatic grace, then pulled a button, and the restaurant opened its doors. At the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor, he turned naturally, and she was there as well. He had risked all for the lady. In the middle of the night, the woman he had whispered secrets to stole. The woman he promised things he previously promised Julia. She stood there fixed in place, eyes wide with fear as she absorbed the scene. The romantic supper, the candlelight, the two of them together. His inhale stopped. His body grew stiff all around. "Julia," said, surprise, her voice tinged with delight. Stillness descended upon the table, like a weighted blanket. The woman stared at him, uncertainty developing into insight. "You said you ended things," she snarled, voice quivering with rage. Julia gave a cheeky smile. "Oh, he told you that too?" She went to face him. "You really ought fresh material, darling." His jaw tightened, panic flaring in his eyes. "Julia, kindly allow us to just..." "Let's just what?" asked. She stopped and arched an eyebrow. "Talk about your behind-my-back sleeping pattern with her. Talk about how you imagined you could play us both and never be discovered." She slanted forward, voice tinged with poison. "Was it worth it, tell me?" The other woman laughed, crossed her arms. "You mentioned you were going to be leaving her." Julia chuckled, a sharp, frigid sound. Shaking her head, she responded, "Oh, sweetie, He never intended to part from me. You were really only a diversion, one that is somewhat disposable, I suppose." The woman's face contorted with wrath, and for the first time the dread in his eyes became pure, unvarnished terror. Now murmurs and inquisitive looks abound. The diner had become an audience. Eyes watched, murmured, waiting for the fallout. Julia grabbed her glass, slow drink taken, then set it down once more. "I wonder how long it will take before everyone at your office finds out," she said. "Possibly your family as well. Your mates." She turned her head slightly. "Should I forward to them the screenshots?" His face took on ghostly white. "Julia, don't." She shrugs. "I suppose you ought to have considered that before you chose to make me look like a fool." Between them, a quiet that was slow. Then Julia grabbed her purse and elegantly got out of her chair without more comment. She looked across to the other woman. "You're welcome to him," she added nonchalantly, "but I wouldn't get too cozy if I were you. He lies on a regular basis." She then turned away, leaving him seated there broken, vulnerable, and totally alone. He had forfeited everything by the end of the evening, and the finest thing is, he never even considered it as likely. After Julia left, the restaurant had become uncomfortable silent, but harm had already been done. It was all too much. The whispers, the murmurs, the snatched looks from adjacent tables. Their criticism felt to him as like a weight crushing down on him, suffocating, relentless. Frozen, he sat there as the ruins of what ought to have been a flawless evening fell around him. The candle between them flickering seemed more like an exposed spotlight on his shame now. Its warm warmth changed, sharp and merciless. Julia's voice still reverberated in his ears. Then there was her. He had risked everything for the woman he had spent months surreptitiously exploring, expecting a night of pleasure. The woman who had passed through those doors minutes ago, discovered, she was part of a public execution. She stood there, arms folded, furious eyes flashing. She snarled low but sharp, "You lied to me." He breathed sharply and ran his fingers down his face. "Not here, please. Not here." She shook her head and laughed without amusement. "You made a fool of me here, thinking you were about to make some great romantic gesture, and instead," her voice now attracted greater attention. He stiffened and looked about the diner. People were fixated once more. Already tonight he had been embarrassed. Another scenario would not be something he could manage. Gritted teeth let him whisper, "Lower your voice." She laughed, approaching closely. "Oh, now you're worried about appearances? You ought to have considered that before you assured me of things you never meant to follow through on." His jaw tightened. "The time is not right for this." She shook her head, disgust flitting over her features. "You know what? No, you're deserving of this." She turned on her heel, reached for her purse. "Enjoy the mess you created." She also vanished exactly like that. He inhaled the breath he hadn't noticed he was holding until the restaurant doors closed behind her. At last he was just alone, and he felt it for the first time in many years. The nothingness, the real truth. Julia had been perfect about everything. He grabbed for his wine, downing the rest in one swallow, then threw enough money on the table to cover the bill. He pushed back his chair and left the restaurant, hoping he could at last have some time to reflect once he got home. Without another look around, still he ought to have known better. Julia never was one to depart softly. He entered the flat and it was very quiet. There is no gentle music playing from the speaker, no aroma of Julia's preferred candles ablaying. The space seems incorrect, freeze, empty in a manner never felt like before. He moved farther inside and felt a cold run down his spine. Something was absent. Turning on the light, he looked about the living room. Julia had fixated on decorative pillows. Gone. Once along the walls were the framed pictures, put empty hooks in their place. His pulse sped as he headed for the bedroom. He drew the closet doors open. There was half the space unoccupied. Her garments, her shoes, her rucks, all done. His heart thumping, he entered the bathroom. Usually overflowing with her skincare products and fragrances, the counter was spotless, though it was fading quickly, like she had never actually been there at all. The smell of her still hung in the air. Not one. She wouldn't have departed as shown here. Not wordless either. He noticed it then as well. One on the counter in the kitchen. His name was written clearly in Julia's handwriting on the front. His appetite plummeted, his hands quivering slightly. He grabbed it and tore it apart to expose the note within. "Did you think my revenge finished at dinner? His breath stammered. You danced with my dignity, heart, and trust. You made me the stupid one. But right now it's your time. His pulse thumping faster with every line. His hold on the paper tightened as his gaze perused the remainder of the letter. While you were busy tonight, I made a few adjustments. Once more looking about the apartment, something dark twisted in his gut. Then he turned to see the paper stacked next to the envelope. Statements of banks. He took them up, flitting through the pages, and his fingers shook. Account balances depleted. Every joint account they had opened together, empty. Every dollar they had invested collectively, transferred. His head turned, and then there came the apartment leasing agreement. His gaze fixed on the revised contract, and his breath froze. The name Julia had been taken off. Right now the lease was just in his name. His gut turned over as awareness came upon him like a tidal wave. She had consumed all of it, not only her personal items, not only her wealth, but also her ideas. She had left him entirely weightless. Now solely his responsibility were the rent and the expenses, things they had usually split. One he couldn't afford on his own was responsibility. Gritted his teeth, then turned back to the letter. And there at the very bottom, the last nail in his coffin. You always assumed you were one step ahead of me. You were smoother, smarter, untouchable. But guess what, sweetheart? You were checkingers. I was in chess mode. Have fun with your fresh existence. Just you will be paying for it. He crushed the letter in his fist, jaw tightly squeezed, causing pain. His whole body shook, not with remorse but with gloom. In fury, she had outdone him, in every conceivable manner. He had failed. And the worst aspect is also here. He never really noticed it approaching.
Cheaters always think they're smarter, until they meet someone like Julia. She didn't just catch him, she destroyed him. But revenge doesn't stop with a broken heart. What happens when the betrayal is even bigger? When it's not just love at stake, but an entire legacy? Jake was erased, left with nothing. But here's the thing about people who lose everything, they have nothing left to lose, and that makes them dangerous. Click now, before he takes it all back.